Okay, our numbers are still going up, so maybe we'll make a slow and easy start to give people who are still joining us a chance to get into the room without missing anything. So welcome everybody, great for you to all be here today for the Mastering Software Architecture webinar. My name's Matt, I'm one of the trainers here at Neueda, and on the webinar today we've got Mark Richards, who is a software architect, an author and instructor, and Nick, who is our technical director, and I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves in a moment or two. Before we do that, I'll just outline the plan for today's session. So after the introductions, we're going to hand over to Mark to give us a little bit of a teaching about software architecture. Following that, we're then going to have a chat between the three of us, and then there will be some time at the end for questions. I'll come back and talk a bit more about questions in a moment or two. But before we do that, let's get some introductions. Mark, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matt. And hello, Nick. Good to see you again. My name is Mark Richards. I am a hands-on software architect and also the founder of developer2architect.com. I'm also an author, a consultant. I do quite a bit of training within software architecture, which is one of my passions, which you will soon see in this webinar.
Perfect, thank you. And Nick?
Yeah, hi everyone, great to see you. I recognise some of the names on the webinar there, so good to see you, those of you I recognise. Yeah, so my name's Nick Todd, been working with Neueda for over 20 years now, delivering all sorts of training programs, and many of them have been around the subject of software architecture, particularly most in the last couple of years. I've been a software architect in the past, worked on various different projects, big and small in the cloud mainly, but not exclusively, and we've been running some quite long and involved programs on software architecture for a number of our clients recently. So yeah, looking forward to this webinar and engaging with you all.
Thank you, Nick. So as I said, I'm one of the trainers here. My name is Matt. I primarily really do full stack training, so a range of different training aimed at developers. So my interest is actually more about architecture for developers than architecture for architects. So this is going to be an interesting session for me. Before we start the teaching, there is on the right-hand side of your screen a section called Q&A, which you can use to ask any questions you like. Now, we will have, hopefully, some dedicated time for questions at the end, but feel free to put questions in at any point. We'll keep an eye on them. If it feels like there's a good opportunity to bring your question out, we will do so. If not, hopefully we'll get to them at the end of today's call. So please feel free to use that as you like. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mark to give us a bit of an introduction to software architecture, please.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. Let me just get my screen share going here so that you all hopefully can see that now. Let me just reconfigure. Fantastic. So as Matt said, I'll talk for maybe about 10 minutes about some aspects of software architecture, and then we'll engage in a really cool fireside chat. So I thought one of the things that would be good to start this webinar with was actually to kind of define software architecture. Excuse me, 1 second there. There we go. Really, what is software architecture? This might be a good question to ask before we dive into some of the challenges and details we're going to talk about. And one of the common metaphors of software architecture is that it represents the structure of a system, much in the same way as we associate the structure of a building. And this is a very common metaphor for software architecture. However, in this little short teach it part, I'm going to show you why this metaphor, while good to describe software architecture, tends to fall apart and where it falls apart. So the first thing I want to really talk about is why software architecture is so critical for businesses. So if you're going to build a doghouse for your pet, you certainly do not need an architecture. All you need is a hammer, some nails, and some wood, and all is fine. However, if we're going to construct a 10-story office building, you must have an architecture. Can you imagine if we didn't have an architecture for a 10-story office building and a bunch of craftsmen, plumbers, electricians, masons, all got together and just started to build this building, well, it would probably start looking something like this, or even this little, shall we say, nightmare. But it's not only the external structure, it's the internal structures as well. Misfit stairs, or even stairs that, well, quite frankly, lead nowhere. By the way, this is the kids' room. These are the kind of things that happen without architecture. And as a matter of fact, the same thing happens for systems. Large systems without architecture start to look like this, as opposed to well-formed, structured systems. This is why architecture is critical for businesses. Now, when we talk about architecture, what we're really talking about are the capabilities of a system. And when I refer to capabilities, I'm really referring to all of those ilities. Some people call these non-functional requirements. I call them architectural characteristics. Things like scalability, reliability, fault tolerance, maybe responsiveness, agility. These are all capabilities of a system. And those capabilities are what architecture supplies. Because when we start to talk about functionality of a system, that produces that system's behavior. And the point is, these are two very different things. One of the things a lot of technologists, well, maybe fail to realize or minimize is the capabilities of a system as opposed to that behavior of a system. So I want to talk about also some key challenges that business face with respect to software architecture. And I want to make a couple of key assertions and key points here. And the first key point comes back to that metaphor about architectures, software architecture, and building architecture. Because unlike buildings, software architecture must be malleable, must be flexible, because it has to change as the business changes. We can't do that easily or at all with the structure of large buildings. Oh, can you imagine putting a 10-story office building up and then saying, about 6 months later, we'd like to remove 4 of those stories, or we'd like to add 10 more, or we'd like to double the width of this building. This is the external structure. And typically we think about building architecture as something that's static. Software architecture is not. It must continue to change as technology changes, business changes, and our environment changes. This, everyone, is where the metaphor between software architecture and building architecture break down. Because in order for this to happen, what we essentially do is something called iterative architecture, something really not possible with buildings. And when I mean about iterative architecture for greenfield applications, these are new systems, is we develop an initial architecture. Typically, we call that a naive architecture. And that's based on known requirements, known knowns. And basically, as new requirements come in, we iterate on that architecture to be able to satisfy those additional unknown or new requirements as they surface. As a matter of fact, we do iterative architecture on brownfield architectures as well. Existing systems that we work on transformations of those existing systems as new requirements, new market conditions, new business direction emerges. And this is one of the key differences between architecture in systems and architecture in buildings. Now, it's interesting, and I do want to interject here, that 20, 30 years ago, businesses certainly changed. But it took 6 months, maybe 1 year, for a business to maybe pivot to a different kind of market condition. Today, my observations in the industry is that these pivots happen quickly. Within a quarter, within a month, businesses are able to now repivot and move and react to certain market conditions, certain business conditions. And it turns out these days, it's actually our systems, the architecture that starts to become that bottleneck. So this is a critical key challenge for businesses to keep their architectures flexible, agile, and malleable. Now, another key point I want to stress is that architecture in systems does not live alone. It doesn't live in a silo, but rather must be aligned with other aspects of the business to be successful and to work. And as a matter of fact, we call these the intersections of architecture. And more formally, a funny word, architectural nexus. Nexus meaning the collection of intersections. And as a matter of fact, in order for architecture to work, and this points to one of the key challenges business face, is that architecture must be aligned with implementation, but also infrastructure. It has to be aligned with data topologies, engineering practices of how we develop software. Also, team topologies, which impact architecture, and architecture can impact the success and effectiveness of those team topologies. Systems integration, the overall business environment, and also the enterprise. Architecture has to be aligned with all of these in order to work. Which brings me to my third and final key point here. And that is architecture must also be governed and measured in order to work properly. I just mentioned about alignment with all 8 of these factors within our business and technology environment. But how do we know they're aligned? And this brings in a new concept called architecture as code, where we can actually, through executable source code, not only describe our architecture, but govern and measure the structural aspect, operational aspect, and process aspect as well. And by marrying these 2 key points together, we can see that we need alignment of architecture with these areas in order for architecture to work. And we overlay architecture as code as the way to not only validate that alignment, but also ensure that alignment stays in place. So I want to summarize the kind of teach-in part of this by actually just doing a quick summary of what makes software architecture so hard. I have been in this industry for over 40 years. Yeah, that's over 4 decades. And as a software architect for almost 30 of those years. And I can tell you firsthand, yes, software architecture is hard. And why is it hard? Identifying these architectural characteristics and capabilities of the system can sometimes be quite challenging. Also, identifying and analyzing corresponding trade-offs based on those. Making the most appropriate architecture decision based on those trade-offs and capabilities is key, but also can be challenging. Analyzing and governing the architecture, as well as understanding and getting a grasp of the overall business and technical environment. Having exceptional interpersonal skills makes architecture hard. It's not all about technology and structure. It's all about leading and guiding teams, negotiation, facilitation, collaboration, and also finally, just keeping up with the latest technologies, architecture, and business trends. This is really what makes software architecture so hard. But enough of me talking. I'm anxious to engage now in our fireside chat to talk about these kind of aspects and also address some of the questions all of you may have in the webinar.
Thank you, Mark, and lovely final image there as well. You've raised a number of interesting points. I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion, but I want to start by saying, Nick, is there anything, or what resonates with you most from what Mark's been talking about in relation to the classes that you take on architecture?
Yeah, I think most of it resonates. Brilliant what you said, Mark, really helpful, and I'm sure the audience would have found that really useful as well. It's such a great distilled summary of what we're talking about when we discuss architecture. But I think your final slide was really key in terms of those things that make it hard. And I think that having those interpersonal skills is often underestimated. I would perhaps observe people think of it as a technical role, but actually it is technical, obviously, but there's so much more to it than that. I mean, my question, perhaps, just if I may ask a question just to kick off, is I imagine on our call today there are some who are architects, but there are others who perhaps would love to be architects, or would love to be able to describe themselves confidently as an architect. And when we look at that list on that final page, in your view, what do you think are the most important traits that would help someone, say, who wants to be an architect but wouldn't feel confident to describe themselves as one right now? Where do you think generally people need to perhaps develop their skills in order to be able to label themselves as an architect?
Yeah. Well, so in my experience, and I'll speak of my experience and those of my close friends and colleagues as well. There are, well, as you mentioned, Nick, there's a large gamut of what an architect is responsible for and expected to do. Too many times we do focus on the technical aspect and focusing on technical breadth and such of learning different technologies and platforms. It's been my experience and observation that there are really some very, very, very good technical architects out there. However, it's my opinion that 50% of being an effective software architect are, in fact, those soft skills, those people skills. And there's a key reason why I say this, and in my experience. First of all, and as a matter of fact, I've got like 15 different tangents and horse racing through my head right now of different things. But the first and the foremost, you may be a fantastic technical architect. You may know, for example, cloud or microservices better than you think anybody else does. But here's the problem. There are probably about 10,000 other architects who are just as good or better than you are technically. So how do you differentiate yourself in the industry? And those key soft skills, those people skills, are one way to do this. That is one key differentiation. However, Nick, I want to, I'll finish up. I just want to tell a quick anecdote of why I have such a strong feeling about the soft skills and developing those as an architect. So let's say, Nick, that you're a developer and a really good developer, and you start to sling some code, and you realize that all of a sudden you're entering into a lot of cyclomatic complexity. If then else, if then else, if then else. Well, as a great developer, Nick, what you do is, of course, start saying, whoa, this is not good. And you implement the template pattern along with the strategy design pattern and remove basically all of that cyclomatic complexity in your code. And that's great. Touche, we do some high fives, but no one's really going to care. However, let's say, Matt, that you are the lead architect on our customer relationship management system, and you're about to lose your job because we just had a security audit. And of course, the corresponding customer database, which you're responsible for, Nick, in our system, everybody has access to. And that's a huge security problem. Also, everybody's accessing this database. And so consequently, we have bad response time, and there's rogue queries and reports going against this. And then we're making a major acquisition of another company, and we're going to incorporate their CRM system, which means we need to make major changes, but no one will let us do it because it disrupts all these other systems. So Matt, as a really effective software architect, says, no, forget this. I want to keep my job. And so Matt makes a single architecture decision. We will use application silos, meaning only the owning system of a database can access it. No one else can. And by this one decision, Matt has solved all three problems. Systems have to now talk to us to get to the data. That solves security. We get great response time because we're the only ones talking to the database, and we can change that structure as much as we want. What's the difference between these two analogies? The difference is anyone going to challenge you, Matt, about those architecture silos or that architecture decision? And the point is, everyone will. So the key point I'm getting out here is, as an architect, almost every decision you make will be challenged. It will be challenged by stakeholders who deem it too expensive or take too long. It will be deemed by other architects who have a better idea. It will also be challenged by developers who, well, I don't want to do it that way. I think it's better to do this way. That is where the soft skills come in, because it requires keen collaboration, communication, and negotiation and facilitation to really get anything done as a software architect.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant analogy, because that's the kind of thing we have to do, isn't it? It's funny, on our programs when we run these architectural, as Neueda, where we run these usually typically year-long architects training programs, this like 50-50 is that professional skills and 50 is the technical skills, because of the importance of those professional skills. Another question, actually, we've talked about Matt as I was the developer, wasn't I? Matt was the architect. Here's a question that come up literally last week on one of our architectural training programs, and we discussed it as a class. It'd be interesting to see what you think as well. Is, where does Matt sit? Is Matt the architect in the team with me, the developer? Or is Matt in an ivory tower? He's 4 floors up. He's got his own private office and only occasionally pops down to talk to us mere mortals who are writing the code. Or actually, is Matt just one of the team but happens to be functioning in that architecture role with us while we're making this decision? I mean, there's these different models, aren't there, of architects, whether they above the team, in the team make the decision together, or there's no, it's just almost luck that good architecture emerges. What have you observed amongst different organizations and companies around those different models and the strengths and weaknesses of where these decisions are taken?
Yeah. Wow. So Nick, what a great discussion, because you just brought out an additional key challenge that businesses face with respect to software architecture, is that role, or where that architecture is, or that architect is. And more importantly, how many architects do we need? Because they're really busy and they're usually spread too thin. I love how you started this, Nick, because, and I'm wondering why we keep picking on Matt, but poor Matt. But yes, but there's so many anti-patterns associated with being a software architect. The ivory tower architect you mentioned, where everything is so clear from way up at the very top of the building. And this is still prevalent that I observe, unfortunately, where there's a lack of collaboration and communication, that the architect is making decisions because that's what they're charged with doing. But that lack of collaboration and communication, decisions get, quote, handed down to development. And there are, well, we could spend an entire webinar talking about the problems with that kind of anti-pattern, lack of understanding. I don't know why you made this decision. But then there's another opposite, and that is an architect that is too heavily involved in the development team. We call those, it's another anti-pattern called the control freak architect. Those architects that are so in your face from a development perspective that they're trying to control every aspect of the development process. These kind of architects are exactly the opposite, Nick. They steal the art of programming away from developers. This is a challenge as a software architect. There is a great technique, and it is called elastic leadership, which is a technique you can use to be able to determine how much involvement should I, as an architect, have on a development team. I outlined this, by the way, in one of the later chapters of my book, Fundamentals of Software Architecture, in part 3, which is all the soft skills part. And this tool, essentially, this technique, involves basically 5 factors to determine during the course of any given effort or project or product, how much effort should, or how much involvement should I have? The team size is an influence, large versus small teams. The team level of experience, senior developers, well-seasoned developers versus junior developers. The project complexity, the time, the duration of that project. These are some of the factors that we adjust and measure to know where in the dial do I sit between being more ivory tower and being more of a control freak. So this actually is kind of a key point. But Nick, I'd love to expand this discussion a little bit to talk about that whole thing of architectural thinking and what an architect does and thinks like an architect. We tend to think of, I think, the architectural training that we all do, all of this for architects. But how often, Nick and Matt, do you train or teach non-architects, developers?
I think that's a brilliant question, because I thought it's like, who needs to know and understand what we're discussing? And there can be a temptation perhaps in the industry that it's people who've got architect on their business card somewhere. The word is there. Whereas actually, I mean, I don't know what you think, Mark, but I think actually for developers, senior developers, those who write code and practice code, we all need to have some level of awareness of architect. The more the better, in terms of understanding some of the concepts, right down to the low-level design, right up to the big picture architect, the hard decisions, decisions that are hard to change, those really important architectural decisions. The more that as a technical community, we have understanding of these concepts. I was with in a meeting yesterday, an investment bank in London, and we were talking about an architectural training program, and it just came up. Our developers need, more of our developers. We weren't talking our architects need. It was our developers need a better understanding of what software architecture is all about. I don't know if you've had any thoughts on that, Mark, as well, what you've seen in the industry more wide, or views.
Very, very passionate about this particular topic. And most of the architecture training that I do, there are some architects, but I get so excited and so energized because most of the architecture classes that I teach are mostly developers. And they could be other stakeholders as well, from operations, from I've had some product owners, business stakeholders in my architecture classes. And this makes me very, very happy. And it makes me happy because of several reasons. One, I talked about those intersections of architecture in my little talk. And in order for me as an architect to be able to effectively collaborate and align my architecture with all 8 of these facets, well, necessarily, it's going to require these stakeholders in those particular areas to have a basic understanding of architecture so that we can collaborate and communicate effectively. But more importantly, this is great. I love this conversation, Nick, because it ties back to our prior one about the fact that where does Matt sit? I mean, is he ivory tower? Is he a control freak? Well, the point is, it's all too easy to become an armchair architect or a ivory tower architect because we simply get spread too thin. We can't be everywhere at once. And so this is one of my big passions of bringing architectural concepts and architectural thinking to the development teams. And this helps not only developers help chart a career path, but the more a development team can apply architectural thinking, see a problem with an architect's point of view, understand those capabilities, the better collaboration we have with those too thinly spread architects. But also, let's put it this way, it just creates more effective software architecture. We have fewer issues, less collaboration needed, which means now as an effective software architect, I can be where I'm needed to be and not where I probably shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's very good. And I think another challenge we get often with the ivory tower or the architects spread too thin, perhaps, is often they're not. One of the things you said in your list, why it's hard, is you've got to keep up to date, haven't you, with the technology? And I think often I mean, a caricature. I did see this once in a logistics company where, I don't know if you remember when XML was kind of the answer to everything. Do you remember? It was like in the early 2000s. We need XML for that and XML for that. I mean, it's microservices now, isn't it? But it was XML. And I remember being in this company where the architect had mandated that XML would be used between every layer within the application. And you sort of can picture in your mind the caricature of the architect is they've just read an article somewhere about how fantastic XML is and thought, let's bring that in. And then they've just mandated it. But it's actually the team that are building the app who've got the best knowledge, the closest knowledge to the actual system. That I remember being with them, they would say, this is never going to work. It's never going to work. And it didn't. but I had to build it because that's, like you say, the architect mandated that architecture onto the team. And I think that's one of the challenges, isn't it, as architects, that we don't, we keep up to date, we keep current, we keep relevant. We're not bringing in outdated or inappropriate architectures into systems because we're not keeping them up to date.
I completely agree. If you remember that list of what makes architecture so hard, this actually, I think we can add to another key challenges business face. Because how do you procure architects? How do you grow software architects? I have been, as I said, in the industry for 40 years, 30 of those as a software architect. And I can tell you it's through experience. But the problem is this: to gain that architectural experience, I have had a lot of failures. Oh, it would fill up an entire webinar talking about my failures as a software architect. Lessons learned that I took to heart that made me next time, after that, a much better and effective software architect. But we're talking about charting a course, Nick, over 30 years. Companies don't have that much time to grow software architects, which is why I'm so passionate about education and training in architecture. Why I've written, 7 books related to software architecture is just, it acts as a catalyst so that we, Nick, you, Matt, myself, others who do this kind of architecture evangelism and architecture training can help developers and junior architects and even senior architects avoid some of the lessons learned that we've all experienced. And that is so incredibly valuable because it's not only, painful, but those lessons learned, as you both know, can be really expensive as well.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Can I ask on that point? So one of the things I know we see is we do onboarding programs for lateral hires in some of our companies, right? So we'll have developers are coming in to work for this organization for the first time, and those companies want their developers to know about that organization's strategy around the governance, maybe more of than the practicals of architecture. But one of the challenges there is, how do you communicate those failures so that everybody learns from that knowledge? How do you communicate best what's worked, what hasn't worked, that company's particularly done?
Wow, that's a huge challenge, Nick. I hope you have an answer. Because
I do have some. Yeah, I do have something of an answer. I'm a pilot, right? So I fly planes, and in aviation, it's a safety culture, and I think there's an element of that. We did a operational excellence program for an investment bank about 10 years ago now, and part of it was that helping to address that very issue. And what we do in aviation, there's a website. If you don't like flying, don't visit this website, right? But it's called avherald.com, and it catalogs. You're all going off. Don't look at it now. You're supposed to be listening. But it catalogs every aviation, or nearly every aviation incident, accident, all the rest of it, all over the world. Why is it on this website? Why is it there? Why do people go and read it and see what's going on? It's not because you're morbid curiosity or you just want to name and shame and, it's another accident from whoever. It's about safety culture. You want people to learn. So you read it and think, right, I'm going to make sure I don't do that. And so having some kind of documentation that captures, the good stuff, but also the bad stuff. Perhaps, Mark, we talked we were chatting the other day about how we capture our decisions as architects. I don't know if, often I'm sure we've all been there, where you're looking at some code or some application and you think, why on earth did they do that? What were they thinking? And actually having some kind of record of that decision can be really helpful, and that will feed in also to things that didn't work. We'll say, oh, well, that's why they made the decision. That wasn't a good decision, but at least you've got a record of it. I think that could be part of it as well. So it's those it's at the end of the day, I think big part of the answer to Matt's question, I don't know what you think, Mark, is documentation, capturing the decisions, capturing the rationale, the reasons, and some of it will work out really well for you. Some of it won't, but at least it's captured, and we can learn from that documentation.
And Nick, I love how you turned Matt's question to this this direction, because you're absolutely right. How do we avoid making these terrible lesson learned mistakes in architecture decisions? In our first book, The Fundamentals of Software Architecture, we coined 2 laws of software architecture. And that first law is that everything in software architecture is a trade-off. But we also coined a second law, which points to your comment, Nick, and that is why is more important than how. And this is key to software architecture, because I can look at a diagram and I can see how this system is going to be constructed. I can see how things will communicate. But what I don't know is why you did it that way. And it turns out in architecture, this is incredibly important. And so what we're talking about is really that justification piece. And architecture decision records, ADRs, are one thing I, as well as a lot of my clients, have found is a very, very effective way of not only capturing the essence of why I'm having to make a decision and why I made the particular decision, but also those ADRs, those architecture decision records, form that kind of why documentation. And here's the other beauty of why I'm so happy, Nick, that you turned the conversation and pivoted it this way, is because with an architecture decision record, we can avoid the ivory tower. I make a decision, I justify it, I publish an ADR. Well, that's kind of pointing towards an ivory tower versus I think this decision is pretty sound. This is my justification, but I can put the status of that ADR as request for comment. In other words, I can collaborate with development teams, other architects, to challenge my justifications, my thoughts, my assertions and assumptions. And this being ADRs, facilitates, it acts as a vehicle for collaboration between development teams, between stakeholders who are wondering why we are 2 times over budget. And this is the why piece. And it allows a collaboration to say, well, you know what, you're right. I could probably cut that cost in half if we did it that way. And I adjust the ADR correspondingly. Part of the justification of why didn't you do it this way is because it cost twice the amount of money. So this is a great collaboration vehicle for all kinds of collaboration with stakeholders.
Yeah, I think we've got about 18 or 19 different questions in the Q&A, so we better come to those. But just to stay on the ADR, just one comment, that's all. When we've run our architectural leadership training programs, it's the ADRs often is one of the highlights of the program in terms of something that brings actionable change by the people on the training. So they'll introduce them to their teams and they start using them. We've seen that in 2 different companies now where they've started implementing ADRs. I think you were involved in the training on one of them, and they're now doing that. Yeah, because those ADRs are so valuable. Matt, do you want to? Is there any questions?
The time is flying past, and I want to get some of these questions out, if you don't mind me, Mark. Particularly, I mean, there's a couple here, and I'm not going to get to all of them, but one that's just jumping out at me. What are your thoughts about using, they've said LLM, so AI in software architecture?
Oh, good. I'm so glad. I was hoping we would get onto this particular topic, which will consume the rest of the day, as a matter of fact. But,
you have 2 minutes. 2 minutes maximum.
2 minutes. Okay. The whole intersection of architecture and the AI ecosystem is quite a fascinating one. I have done enough of my own personal research as well as research in collaboration with other companies to pretty much verify that right now, at least, AI has a different usage in architecture than in development. I can't use AI effectively as an assistant at least that I have found. When we try to make architecture decisions, or to say, well, should I use orchestration or choreography here? These are things that not only can I not Google, but I also can't ask an LLM about because of trade-offs, because of context. And these are not probable answers. These are answers I need for my particular capability of the system. So we've seen a different, at least in my view, and Nick, I'll give you another, after another minute here, a chance to interject. Kind of a pivot from an architectural standpoint of two areas. First is AI-driven architecture. The ability to leverage an LLM to be able to observe, make observations about my system, and be able to dynamically change and modify that system without human intervention. I think about the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey with HAL computer. HAL was an AI-driven system. And the point is, we already have the capabilities of being able to add these types of patterns to our architectures. So,
yeah. I think what I've observed is that we can use the AI to help us, like, generate the applications, generate the code, and so on. But the architect still needs to come up with the architecture. And even if you generate, like, for example, recently I used AI to convert a Perl application into a Python application. And even with that, and you say, I want it generated, using good practices and all the rest of it, you still, with an architectural hat on, you need to verify and review what it's coming up with. If you're creating an app using, I don't know, React or Cloud Developer Kit or whatever it is, it doesn't necessarily come up with something that has an architecture that fits the various trade-offs that you might have to be encountering in your own setup. And the AI is never going to know that. So there's going to, the moment, like Mark said, I'm not sure it doesn't help us completely with the architecture. But if you've got some of that architectural knowledge up there, when you're using these tools, you can really get some quality code out of the tool because you know how to phrase the question, you know how to phrase the prompt to get the right kind of application that uses the right architecture designs and so on, because you've got that knowledge, which is why these training programs are so helpful around architecture.
Well, as a matter of fact, Nick, to kind of close this topic, as an architect, there's a lot in the AI ecosystem right now. But from an architectural perspective, there's three things every architect should become very, very familiar with, because these impact the structure of the system. And that is guardrails, evals, and of course, RAG, retrieval augmented generation. And these three pieces of the huge ecosystem are ones that really reduce the overwhelming aspect of, well, as an architect, what should I really know? Those are the three categories of products and techniques that I would very much encourage every architect to really fully understand.
Yeah.
We're officially out of time, but I'm going to make the executive decision that we keep going for a bit longer, if that's okay with the two of you.
Yeah.
We've got quite a few questions that actually all come around a certain theme. So there's questions like, what's the hello world? How do I get started? What certification should I be doing? How do I move from developer to architect? So for somebody in that place, I'd like to ask both of you, what do you think is the place? How do you start learning this kind of stuff?
Oh, that is a good question. Yeah,
well,
I think what you want to avoid. Oh, sorry, Mark. I was just going to say you don't really want to have to go through 30 years of experience to get there, do you? So ideally, like Mark was saying, I think that's where training programs like the ones we offer at Neueda are really useful, obviously, because they help you learn and give you confidence in your skills. But a lot of it is ultimately, I think, I don't know if you agree or not, Mark, but it is experience in the end, and having experience in different technologies as well. I was involved, for example, in a project recently, and the team, I was brought in as the architect, and the team was saying, oh, we need to do a .NET monolith. Has to be a .NET monolith. And it was just, and the reason they said that is because that's what they knew. And there was nothing intrinsically terrible about that, but because that's what they knew, that was the solution. Whereas actually, as an architect, you want to have exposure to different options. So I could write a .NET monolith, I suppose, if I wanted to, or a Java one, or do a cloud distributed whatever. But it's having that breadth of knowledge and understanding, so you understand the different approaches that you might take, whether it's that example or other examples as well, isn't it? And the breadth, I think, is a big part of it. I don't know if you've got any thoughts, Mark, if you want to throw in as well, obviously.
Yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, you hit one of them. My answer to that question, and to anybody who's thinking, how do I start to become an architect? I always answer, start thinking like an architect. You see, architectural thinking is not just for architects. You can think like an architect as a developer, a tech lead as well. And what do I mean by that? Nick actually hit on one of those points, and that is to start focusing on your technical breadth of knowledge. These are things you know that you don't know. In other words, you become familiar with. You're not an expert in these languages, platforms, tools, but you're familiar with those buzzwords. You know how to apply them, maybe. So technical breadth is key, but it's also architectural thinking and starting to act and think like an architect is to start focusing and understanding and become knowledgeable about those capabilities of the system that you're writing code for. What are the architectural characteristics, the ilities that are important for our system? Is it responsiveness, reliability, fault tolerance? Because the way I code impacts all of those capabilities. And that's what we call that intersection of architecture and implementation. And so that's one way to start thinking like an architect. And here's the other. Start thinking about trade-offs. Oh, they're there. Even as you're coding and you choose a particular algorithm or choose to split methods between two classes or to combine two classes into one, that's a decision you're making as a developer. What are the corresponding trade-offs of that? Because they're there. Now, they might be insignificant, but starting to identify and analyze trade-offs is another way of preparing yourself to become a software architect and practice becoming a software architect. So yes, so those three key pieces.
Yeah, I'd add in just one other, if you agree with this, Mark, but the whole self-awareness. I mean, it might not sound obvious. We talked about it's a very technical skill, but there's those interpersonal skills as well, those professional skills, if you like, just having that awareness of yourself. Just so reading, some of the business books, reading some of those books about, how we psychology, the psychology of how we interact with other people, learning, are you a green person or a yellow, all those different psychology, that is all really valuable if you're going to be, how do you tell a story? How do you convince people? How do you persuade people? I could have said to this .NET team, oh, we ain't doing that. That's old hat. We're going to do cloud and serverless. And they might have just slapped me and cracked on with what they were thinking because I might have been right, but I didn't tell the story. I didn't engage them. I didn't take them on the journey. And I think there's all of that is also really important to become a really effective software architect.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right, Nick. It's starting to practice those soft skills, those people skills, the collaboration, which is required as a software architect. And trust me on this, everyone listening, you will make mistakes when you start practicing these soft skills. And instead of beating yourself up by saying, wow, I have no idea about this whole collaboration thing, don't beat yourself up, but rather reflect and learn on those mistakes and continually improve yourself from those soft skills perspectives. So I couldn't agree more, Nick. That is absolutely a fourth aspect of really kind of starting to chart your path towards a software architect. Yeah.
Thank you both. We're going to have to get closer to wrapping up. And I want to ask you both what your top takeaways from today have been. And I'm going to go first because my top takeaway is absolutely the importance of those soft skills. And I guess maybe that's why we call our programs the Software Architect Leadership Program, right? Because it is very much a leadership role. So not just knowing how to make decisions, how to make the decisions right, actually how to communicate them is my big top takeaway from today. Who of you'd like to go first? What's your top takeaway?
I'm happy to go if you want, Mark, give you a bit longer to think. So yeah, I think my top takeaway is just the importance that, this is going to sound a bit trite, but architecture's for everyone. If I put it like that, architecture for everyone. We can all benefit from learning about architecture, thinking more architecturally. whatever our role is in a team, whether we're the programmer, the senior developer, the junior developer, the tech lead, the architect, obviously, the project manager, whoever we are in that team, the test automation engineer, all of these different skills benefit, and overall the team benefits and the company benefits as we all get more clued up and more become those that think more like an architect. I think that would be my takeaway, that this isn't just for architects.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway, Nick. I think my key one takeaway would be, well, essentially, there's a lot of technical knowledge you need as an architect. You have to know architectural styles, architectural patterns. You have to have that technical breadth. These are all aspects we've talked about, and there's great resources that you can learn these things from. But my key takeaway, I'm actually going to quote. This is my favorite quote out of all quotes in the world, by, I believe it was our 26th president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. And he said this: the single most important ingredient in the formula of success is knowing how to get along with people. And my key point about that quote, don't minimize the importance of the key leadership and soft skills as a software architect. I gave you that analogy of making decisions and everybody's disagreeing. This is an architect's life. Enjoy your time as a developer right now, everyone, because you have so much control over your decisions. So yes, don't minimize those soft skills. Practice them, develop those now.
Yeah, thank you. Any final closing thoughts from either of you?
No, from my perspective, I think this has been just a wonderful, fantastic fireside chat. I'd love to have more of these because there's so many tangents and topics and targeted topics we can get to. So I thought, from my perspective, I think this has been a great load of fun. And I hope those of you listening have gotten able to take away a lot from our kind of informal discussion here about software architecture.
Yeah, absolutely. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed listening to us chatting away. But it's certainly been, I've had a great time anyway, chatting with Mark and Matt. So it's been really helpful just talking through these things, quite stimulating and provoking. And hopefully it's stimulated and provoked many of you on the call today as well.
Yeah, there's been a number of questions we haven't been able to get to. I've just put up on screen the URL and also QR code, which will lead you to the page on our website about our software architecture training. If you want to fill in the form on that to continue the conversation with us, if your questions are questions you're asking because actually there's a need in your organization you want some help with, that's a great reason to fill out that form. We can be in touch. This webinar, we're going to be sending out a link a little bit later on today, hopefully, so that you can rewatch the webinar. So if there were any of the key points that came out that you want to take away, remind yourself about, then absolutely you'll be able to do that. So look out for that. That'll be in your inboxes soon. And I believe that when you leave the webinar, it is going to pop up a feedback survey. So please do fill that out. It'd be great to get some feedback on this because we can use that to take away and improve the future webinars that we do. So I think we probably need to wrap up there. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So I'm going to say thank you both, Mark and Nick.
Can I just interrupt?
Please do.
I'm amazed that generative AI came up. I mean, who's talking about generative AI? But it did come up, didn't it, on our session today? But just to say that Neueda, that we've got an announcement coming up about Gen AI training offerings. So do look out for that. Someone just said, "Oh, you must remind people because they want to know." So I'm doing what I'm told. So,
thanks, Nick. Brilliant. So thank you both again for your time today. Thank you, everybody out there who's joined us today. Let's carry on that conversation with you over time, but hopefully see you on the next webinar in the not too distant future. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.